Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the official Oscarina nomination coverage for The Underdogs. These are the games that managed to earn 2 or fewer nominations, and so rather than have a short 5 to 7 minute video for each, I have edited them together into a compilation. You're going to be hearing from multiple Academy members as they talk up their individual nominees, and I'll try to organize them in such a way as to make for easy listening. This episode features the 5 nominations from 4 games, all of which are competing from the year 1992. Enjoy. Assault Suits Valken, known as Cybernator in the US, is a mech action game developed by NCS Corp. It was released on the Super Nintendo in 1992 in Japan and 1993 in the US. It is a prequel to Target Earth, released in 1990 for the Sega Genesis, and is the second installment in the Assault Suits series. In Valken, you take on the role of Jake Brain as a reluctant mech operator in the thicket of a war over oil. Assault Suits Valken earned 2 nominations for Best Direction and Best Male Character for Jake. Assault Suits is a linear experience, but what makes it striking to me was the abundant usage of story underscoring the entire campaign. Campaign is a very apt description, in fact. So far, this is the first game I've played for the Oscarinas that uses the mixture of linear action progression with character dialogue during and in between missions to ensure there is a continuous connection between the two. Your basic Call of Duty or Halo campaign might not be a remarkable way of merging storytelling with gameplay nowadays, but Assault Suits did it before it was cool. In fact, I had seriously considered putting it forward for Best Pixel and encroaching on other nominations. I eventually went with Contra 3 instead. I did that because as I played more of Assault Suits, I did find the gameplay elements to be pretty lacking. The control scheme is difficult to describe, but you basically have full rotation of your Gatling gun, but this is also mapped to the same D-pad you use to control your character. You can hold one of the buttons down to lock your gun in place, but it's messy. There's also a slide ability which has a long end effect that can be a little unwieldy. It may not seem like much, but honestly, I played this game at least 4 or 5 times for the season, and the control scheme just never clicked. The combat itself is perfectly acceptable, but you put Contra 3 in your Super Nintendo and you tell me how to justify going with Assault Suits when Contra is just so much more smooth and so much more intuitive to control. There is a case to be made that Best Pixel nominees are indeed still games, and if they can't adequately satisfy that, at least a little, then you can see how it's tough to get on board. However, I wanted to get that out of the way first because there are 2 areas for which Assault Suits outclassed Contra and many others, and that's its much stronger emphasis on using the medium for storytelling. Just so you're aware, I'm going to be talking about Direction and Jake for Best Male Character together. So as I said before, you are a soldier in a mech with character dialogue over voice comms interspersed during missions. This chatter makes the characters an ever-present part of the conflict. For the most part, the larger context of the war is lost on Jake and his unit, but there's a pronounced tone of melancholy. Jake and party want this war to end with as little death as possible, and just by having some bits of dialogue reveal how the characters feel about the situation really changes the dynamic. Contra, again, is a good comparison. It's easy to finish Contra and come away from it really focused on your own experience with the gameplay, but Assault Suits doesn't let the player off the hook so easily. The dialogue is also decently productive as it can frequently recontextualize mission objectives or be used to create story moments which justify their existence beyond simple reminiscing. There's one such example when a mech soldier is abandoned by the enemy's side, but the heroes valiantly risk their lives to protect him from certain death. Most of the military opponents are these propaganda drones, but even knowing this, Jake tries to reason with them and even puts his life on the line to protect his enemies in dire situations when the easier path to take would be to simply abandon them or destroy them, making him very much the embodiment of a noble hero. He may be just a soldier, but he's also a man of dignity, as displayed in this scene. This small moment is then built upon in the final mission when he reappears to confront Jake. Jake tells him he's been drinking the warmongering Kool-Aid, but to no avail, and it serves as a comment about how war often necessitates indoctrinating individuals into throwing their lives away at a cause that ultimately isn't in their best interest. The missions themselves can get pretty wild, ranging from infiltration, a suspense-filled cave factory, an orbital descent, and an assault on the Parliament building. In these, you get to see everything the story needs. The first mission, you watch your 2 mech companions eject before following suit yourself. Then when the mission ends, you drop through a hole in the floor, created from the debris of the engine you destroyed, and land on the Versus cruiser. This makes the flow of the mission full circle, and intuits for the player the process typical of the characters. It's just a really nice, elegant flow. I especially like the mission in which you assault a space fortress. Jake's monologue sort of sounds like a war journal, and in the background we can see his mech suit being loaded into position. He talks about the beauty of the skyline against the tragedy this conflict brings, and it sets a powerful tone before the mission begins. These credit scrolls are used before each mission, and they create a good breather and a place that doesn't interrupt the gameplay. It all comes together to create a synergy between player goals, narrative tone, and exposition, which is not really something we see accomplished in Contra. Then, once you're in it, the enemy changes plans into sending their fortress into the planet in total destruction of thousands upon thousands of innocent. When the report comes in, you're commanded to abandon your objective and instead focus on taking out the ship's engines. Along the way, you are confronted by one of the more antagonistic majors who will later become the final boss. Again, the pieces of each scene work well on their own, but they also serve a larger narrative objective. There are all sorts of nice touches of believability throughout the experience. For example, in this very scene, Claire informs you that you have 2 minutes before the trajectory of the crash cannot be avoided. And when she says 2 minutes, that's exactly what she means. This scene, along with one other, are moments when the game presents you with an alternative path. If you are unable to satisfy the objective in time, it actually changes the story's ending. Now I'm about to spoil that ending, so consider this your one-time opportunity to avoid that. To give context leading up to it though, you crash into the office of the chairman of the opposing force who then commits suicide right in front of you in order to avoid standing trial for war crimes. This makes for an extremely mature and bold move for the time, and shows the story was unafraid to show some grit, and adds a weight of heaviness for the story in that there really are only losers in war. In fact, this scene was considered too graphic to show for American audiences, and so it was censored out of the US release. Jake's reaction to this is pretty harsh on this act, calling it the coward's way out. Nevertheless, it's understandable he would be so upset at this stage, because, for one, he has reason to suspect that his love interest Claire has been killed in this war. And two, there's so much senseless violence that had to be done leading up to now, that he's lucky just to be holding himself together at all. This message is further reinforced if you are on track for the bad ending. Jake returns to the Versus and finds everyone has been killed, and this includes capitalizing on his fear by adding Claire to the list of casualties. The devastation is certainly effective, and he basically scolds himself for not being able to prevent this horrific outcome. In line with the psychological drive to want someone to take the blame when bad things happen to us in real life. This definitely shows a sad but honest view of his character and humanity as a whole. However, if you get the good ending, Claire is alive and Jake looks to the future with a glimmer of hope. It's a small touch, but something I really love about how this whole scene is done is that earlier when you destroy an enemy mech, you can see the pilot eject and walk away. And interestingly, you can't kill them because you are Jake, and Jake wouldn't shoot an unarmed enemy. It's not an oversight either, because there are ground units you can kill, specifically the ones who are armed and will open fire at you. Honestly, this really does make Jake a great self-insert character to play because his actions and desires match the stakes of the events around him, and he filters our perspective of the atrocities being committed, which is what a leading man ought to do. And there's little touches of humanity throughout, such as when you fail a mission and he says, "That's on me," signaling how prone he is for self-blame. And then when Claire fails to report back in on the final mission, he checks in but has to continue his mission regardless, showing that he doesn't put his personal feelings above what must be done to end this conflict for the greater good. And while you might see his lack of growth or clear vision as to the war's reasoning as a con, to be fair, he is only a soldier, so in a way, the perspective is like a limited third person. I've sort of gotten off topic here though, because something else that I really loved is that in the end scene when Jake and Claire reunite, we see their small character sprites running toward one another, which makes for a good cinematic crescendo, but also, these are the same size as the enemy soldiers we saw earlier who eject from exploding mechs. Basically, this makes the game's world internally consistent with itself. The game does have a really nice anime outro for a finale, but having a moment that happens within the perspective of the game world that we've been experiencing first-handedly makes everything blend together in harmony. The characters' reunion also helps solidify the game's anti-war message. As it's mentioned, the characters are trying to end the conflict quickly and with minimal loss of life. And as they reflect on what's happened, they hold on to what they have to hope for. And I'll be honest, the writing isn't top-notch, especially when it comes to the villains whose blind allegiance is covered only in essentials. There's not much depth beyond that. It also would have been nice if the context of the war had been explained a little more, but I'm assuming it was mentioned in the instruction manual since it seems to be common knowledge outside of just playing the game yourself. These elements aside, I did enjoy my time with Assault Suits, and definitely feel it's a thoughtful project that hasn't been given enough respect over the years. And I gotta say, when this final moment plays and the music swells, it's one of those Oscarina moments that's an easy feel-good nominee. Assault Suits Valken is best experienced on the Nintendo Switch under an updated port of the same name. It is up for 2 awards this season, Best Direction, Best Male Character for Jake.
Coming up next, we would like to spotlight Super Mario Kart, which was developed and published by Nintendo. The game was released for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System in 1992, and it has been nominated for Best Fellowship and Relaxation. The gameplay of Super Mario Kart is a racing game. So the first topic I want to mention about Mario Kart is that it is easy for any family member or friend to play with you. The required controls are 1 button to accelerate, 1 button to use an item, and the left and right button to steer the car. There are a couple other buttons you can use if you want to steer your car in a particularly ideal way, but those 4 buttons are all you need to strictly play the game. The game also has item boxes, which are used to give you power-ups of sorts during the track, but at least in Super Mario Kart, the item boxes cover almost the entire track, such that you're practically forced to get items as you race. So even somebody who's a complete beginner will still be able to acquire items from time to time, which they can have fun with. Speaking of items are set up to improve the odds of less skilled players being able to win the race. When people are further behind in the race, they get better items, which helps them to catch up from behind. In addition, there's a certain amount of randomness to the items you get. As a result, less skilled players may occasionally get lucky and get a better assortment of items, which may let them win occasionally. The game in general has very friendly and inviting visuals. Players are racing on go-karts, not large race cars. The speed in general is more reasonable and not blindingly fast like F-Zero. The whole game has a very bright and colorful color palette, and the visuals are heavily inspired by Super Mario World, which already had sort of a toy-like appearance to things. Also, if you end up driving off the track, you'll always be rescued by Lakitu, even if it slows them down a bit. Fall into lava, no problem, just a few seconds lost race time. The primary racing mode of Super Mario Kart involves you and a friend both racing in Grand Prix mode, along with 6 other CPU-controlled players. The introduction of these CPU-controlled players makes the game less strictly competitive. You can still focus on getting a better placement with the other CPU players, even if you aren't going to beat your friend. Also, the other CPU-controlled players may attack your friend and cause him to spin out, which gives less skilled players a chance to catch up. And if the players want to have a more strictly competitive experience, they can choose a different race mode, which allows the players to race each other one-on-one. Aside from racing, players also had a battle mode, where players moved around an enclosed space and attempted to remove 3 balloons from the other players. In general, this is less relaxing and a bit more competitive, but in general, it's still good fun, especially if the players are similar in skill level. So it still fulfills some of that fellowship angle to our category. There are still a couple of cons that interfere with it being a perfect relaxation experience. For one, it's very easy to fall off of some of the racetracks, which can detract from the relaxation. And for another, CPUs get help during races, which can sometimes feel cheap and end up detracting a bit from the relaxation. All CPU-controlled players get special abilities. For example, Mario and Luigi have an unlimited supply of invincibility items, which they will use reasonably frequently when they are around you. CPUs also get a feature known as rubber banding, where they will get big speed boosts to catch them up to their intended place in the race. So, for example, if one CPU is supposed to be in second place and they get hit by several red shells, they will end up having a speed boost all the way until they hit second place again. Overall, this diminishes the impact that your items have when you use them against the CPUs, because you might hit them with an item and then shortly thereafter they're back to exactly where they were before. That being said, fellow Oscarina voter Tom wanted to weigh in with the following on why those frustrating factors do not break the relaxing experience of Mario Kart. Even in those places where there is a bit of stress, it's really hard to stay mad or frustrated at the game because it is doing everything in its power to keep the stakes as low and relaxed as possible. There's upbeat, joyful music, there's the toy-like aesthetic you mentioned. Even the use of go-karts as opposed to racing cars really leans into creating that be relaxed, be friends vibe of the game that this game had to set up as the first entry in the Mario Kart series. The next game I would like to spotlight is Ultima VII, which was developed and published by Origin Games. The game was released for MS-DOS in 1992, and it has been nominated for Best Interface. The gameplay of Ultima VII is a large open-world Western role-playing game. Ultima VII completely overhauled the user interface from Ultima VI. Now, the view of the world takes 100% of the screen by default, with other menus only appearing when the user clicks on something or presses a button. This allows for the world objects to be larger, with more pixel detail, and it allows for much more of the world to be displayed at a given time. This also makes it so that the majority of the time, the player is seeing the same visual view that players in the game would see. This improves immersion since it helps the player feel like they're part of the game world. Ultima VII is the first game in the series to allow the game to be fully controlled by the mouse, with optional keyboard hotkeys. This makes the game easier to play, which improves the number of people who can enjoy it, and it allows players to more quickly begin having fun with the game, since it comes more intuitively to players. Certain actions are much more user-friendly now that they can be performed with mouse controls. In Ultima VI, items needed to be moved by issuing individual commands after moving your character to an appropriate location. In Ultima VII, if the item is on the screen or in your inventory, you can just use the mouse to drag and drop items to their desired location. Ultima VII allows for pop-up windows to be used for easier inventory and character management. So, in Ultima VII, you have the option to open pop-up windows for your inventory, your character status, and your equipment, your spellbook, and even chests and corpses in the game world. The player can open many of these pop-up windows at once. The pop-ups can overlap each other, and you can move them around the screen for ease of visualization. Having multiple pop-up windows open at once makes it easy to transfer items between entities. You can drag items from chests to your character to pick the items up. You can transfer items between characters just by dragging an item from the inventory of one character to the inventory of another character. And you can equip weapons by merely dragging the equipment from the inventory pop-up of one character to the equipment slot on the character status pop-up. The game also allows for characters to add chests, satchels, and other carrying objects into your inventory, which allows for easier inventory organization. So, if you move a satchel into your inventory, and then you double-click the satchel, a pop-up will appear for the satchel, allowing you to place items into it. This allows you to use the satchel to keep your items organized, which is particularly important since Ultima allows you to collect a large number and variety of items. So you might have one satchel for spell components, one satchel for money, one satchel for food, and so on. Previous iterations of Ultima split the world into a grid, where each square would contain one person or object. Ultima VII, on the other hand, has a world that allows for almost complete freedom of person and object placement. Characters will move smoothly across the game world. Objects can be moved and placed anywhere on the screen. Objects can even overlap each other, such that, for example, a hidden key may be placed underneath a rock. This allows for Ultima VII to feel more realistic, which improves immersion, and it allows for much easier control of the characters and objects in the game, which reduces the frustration of the player. And the last noteworthy achievement for Ultima VII is its dialogue tree system, where the majority of dialogue options are context sensitive. In most cases, when you start your conversation off with somebody, you get the option to ask their name, their job, and that's it as a starting point. However, once you learn about their name or their job, you will have additional questions that will appear on your dialogue tree, which represent follow-up questions that the main character has the opportunity to ask. So, for example, if they tell you their job, you might have, like, let's say they're the blacksmith, you might have a question about, whether they're the one who forged some local blacksmithing tool, that sort of thing. In addition, other dialogue options will appear depending on the events of the story. For example, you learn about a murder in the starting city of the game. Once you learn about the murder, you can ask individuals in town about the murder to see if they have any useful information. So, this relatively streamlined dialogue tree system means that you don't have to have a lot of unintuitive keywords that don't apply to the situation. Instead, it'll just give you the keywords that are relevant for the character or the situation. That being said, while Ultima VII did make a number of big advancements in terms of interface, there are a couple of cons. For one, despite being more user-friendly than its peers for the time, managing the inventories and equipment of up to 8 characters can get rather cumbersome and time-consuming. This is accentuated by the world having a large amount of stuff that you can pick up and carry with you. Also, during battle, you have control only over your character, while every other character in your group is controlled by AI. The AI can occasionally do dumb stuff like fire arrows in such a way that it hits allies, though from what I understand, it mostly functions fine. The other thing is that battles can get rather chaotic when your 7 allies are battling a group of characters in real time. At the end of the day, a lot of times battles are decided more by how good was the gear you bought or the stats of your allies, more so than how good your strategy was in battle when you have such a large chaotic mess of, allies fighting enemies all at once when you can only control yourself. But that's a subjective preference. It's just for me that makes it so that the interface isn't quite fully perfect.
Streets of Rage 2 is a beat-em-up video game developed and published by Sega for the Sega Genesis in 1992. It is the sequel to the original Streets of Rage from 1991 and sees the player choose from a range of ex-cops who take to the streets once again to clean up this town. It is nominated for 1 award for Best Music Track for Wave 131. The first thing I want to say here is that this is the first game to have the composer mentioned on the title screen, and that composer is Yuzo Koshiro. If you saw last season of the awards, you already heard a sample of his music for the original Streets of Rage, but he also composed the music for both the original ActRaiser and ActRaiser 2. While he hasn't received a nomination before now, his name is attached to a number of Oscarina contenders, making him a fairly prolific composer on the Academy's radar. Now, you don't get your name on the title for no reason. The best way I can sum up his music is that the man is unhinged. It was difficult to secure a nomination for Best Original Score, I think in part because there's always a ruthless competition in both of these categories, but also because of other voters just not seeing the genius that is Yuzo Koshiro here. To give you an idea of the process behind the development of the score, he took a trip to New York and inundated himself with the music scene, which helped serve for his blend of electronic dance, techno synth, and nightclub funk that you hear in Streets of Rage 2. The score's influence is quite significant, inspiring a swath of people to become composers. Being so ahead of his time, the music for Streets of Rage 2 helped propel the importance of legitimacy of video game music. Some of my favorite tracks include Ready Funk, Dreamer, Alien Power, Under Logic, Wave 131, Jungle Bass, and Mad Max. I mention all of these because music track is focused on a single track as a category, but it is also a category with some measure of freedom. By that I mean the arguments for a single track range from the strength of the composition, the placement of the track in the game, the quality of a cover of the song outside of the submitted release version of the game, or even just how the song gets you excited or interested to experience either the game or an equivalent energy from it. Like the Oscar category for Best Original Song, it's a piece of music that may not even appear at any point in the film itself, and as a result, the quantifications for how it contributes to the larger picture of the film is more than a little unclear. You could argue it inspires someone on the creative team, or perhaps the film inspired the songwriter, but either way, it's a space to talk about a work and how its music exists as a reflection of the larger whole. Whether that larger whole is the entire score itself, the entire game itself, or something unknowable outside the realm of feelings. But whatever the case, the nomination for Wave 131 is in many respects a way to honor the composer, the entire score, and the sheer quality that the music adds to the Streets of Rage series. But of course, there does have to be a vote for one track in particular, and depending on which track you choose, it flavors the conversation in a unique way. I spent quite a long time deciding, and I was definitely in the Dreamer camp for most of the time. However, I felt Wave 131 captured the essence of the entire score equally well, but it also served as an excellent companion for the place it plays in-game. You are fighting along a beach at sunset, and going beach-themed shows just how far-reaching the music is able to extend itself. I mentioned before how the music is techno and nightclub in nature, so being able to shift gears into a beach vibe is noteworthy. This effect happens elsewhere with tracks like Under Logic and Alien Power, which harness a baseball stadium or pop culture sci-fi respectively. But I went with Wave 131 because I felt that was a more universally appreciated theme, with or without context. I know it's not most people's favorite. I wouldn't even say it's my favorite. But if I had to choose one track that represents the culmination of the quality of the score, the range of styles represented, as well as serve as the perfect entry point, this would definitely be that song. As I said before, the nomination here is really a way to acknowledge the astounding work for Streets of Rage 2, but also Yuzo Koshiro in a larger sense. So now I'm going to stop talking and let the music speak for itself. If you enjoy what you hear, I recommend checking the game out on Sega Genesis, or even just give the rest of the score a listen. Won't be disappointed.